The story begins with some man in an office at night, sitting at his computer drawing something. He worked hard and drew a comic strip, circling each of the details. His desk was full of cans of energy drink as well as plain water, drops of sweat rolling down his face. He had been like this for 24 hours and he was exhausted. His eyes were glassy and he was as thin as if he had no money for food. He was so tired that he suddenly collapsed to the floor. But finding his strength, he grabbed the table, and with a trembling hand, he tried to rise as his work was not finished. He was furious because he couldn't let his overtime work go to waste, and until he finished his work, he wasn't going anywhere, because there were so many details he had to finish. But his body wouldn't let him keep working, and the guy collapsed under the table again. He was unconscious, his body had shut down from lack of sleep as well as food. He had overworked. At one point, he lost consciousness altogether and died. Our main character's name was William. And yes, this is a story about that man who died from recycling. William woke up in another world, near a monument. The guy came back to life and moved into another body, namely in a young boy who was in despair because his father was attacked by animals and killed while hunting in the mountains. William, or rather the past owner of the body, who depended on his father, was in utter despair and did not know what to do. It was at that moment that our protagonist became possessed in his body. William stood up and looked away from the house. He saw the pieces of meat hanging on the wall, and he wondered what had been the most tragic thing in our hero's past life. It turned out that he had died and did not have time to spend his accumulated wealth, because he had $4,000 on his card. He was very sorry that he did not have time to spend it. All a guy from this world with a dead father needed was a couple pieces of meat. The protagonist immediately started slapping his cheeks and said that how could he complain if he had a priceless chance to live again? Now his new life has taken on new colors, and he must think of ways to make it better. Suddenly, the main character's thoughts are interrupted by a strange sound behind him. Misunderstanding, he decided to turn around and see what was there. In front of him was a bright blue plaque shimmering in different colors, and suddenly an audio message rang out that it was the Peasant's Ascension system, and it had been activated. The protagonist was confused by such a strong glow and tried to cover himself with his hand and realize what appeared in front of him. William tried to understand what was in front of him. After that, he realized that he was the protagonist of this world and would be able to use the system to take over this land. And most importantly, he thought about the greatest harem of 7,000 or 8,000 beauties. He was very excited because in his previous life he had done comic books. Apparently comic books didn't lie about another universe. And William was already imagining how, doing everything according to the story, he would inevitably reach the pinnacle of existence. The guy decided not to waste time and became in a funny pose he is already imagining creating his harem, in which he will have fun, after which all glowing uttered the words that accepts the system. But suddenly the lockout value popped up. The system detected that the host did not meet the system requirements, and the system is temporarily shutting down. The protagonist became enraged and started yelling at the system to stop shutting down so quickly, and explained to him why it was shutting down, and most importantly, what the non-compliance meant. The system informed him that he needed to complete an unmotivated and normal life to prove his abilities, and the system would be activated in his next life. William, standing in front of her, listened to her intently, and didn't understand what she was saying. As soon as he finished listening to it, the main character was pointing his middle fingers at the system in response, for he didn't understand what other ordinary life he had to live, as well as what abilities he had to prove, and what the worthless system was even for. It was as useless to him as possible. The guy's words made the system very angry, because it understood. The system activated a spell for such inappropriate words to her. It was a lightning spell. The system said it was forbidden to say bad words about her. Already fried, the protagonist, lying on the floor, realizing his mistake, and said that he would no longer talk like that. The system went on to say that he asked her too many questions, so he should have consulted the user manual. William gave the system a handshake and told it that it had a bad temper. William questioned what she meant by the pretext that if he ended this life, he would be invincible in the next life. He also wondered what would happen if he disregarded the demands. Would he still be himself in the next life? The system responded that his soul had been archived. During reincarnation, the system kept the main character's memories. Now, no matter what happens, his soul is immortal. Any attack that tries to kill him will return with double damage to the enemy who sent it and kill him. William realized and wondered if it was true that he would have to live another 40-50 years before he could move on to the next life. This annoyed the guy a lot, because he didn't want to wait so long to move on to the next stage, and he thought about the only way to quickly live his current life. And the way he did it was to ask the system if he decided to kill himself. Would that count as living his life, and would he be able to activate the system? The system did not think for a long time, and immediately replied that a real peasant would not dare to die in such a way. The more normal people seek good and try to avoid evil. If the guy his own actions will lead to death, he will not meet the conditions for activation of the system. After listening to the system, the protagonist realized and conceived that the conditions are clear to him. Namely, that he can't find death himself, but he can let death find him. The main character asked the last question to the system. He asked about his current identity. Who was he? William, or the past owner of the body? To which the system responded that his identity was considered a physical body, so he was the identity of the past owner of the body. Smiling and deciding for himself, he said that he understood everything and would work hard to live the life of a peasant. To which the system immediately blurted out the error and said that a true peasant would not work hard. She meant to become someone great. The guy was very tense. A drop of sweat began to roll down his cheek, and he thought about how to get out of this situation. He couldn't think of anything better to do, and just sighed and said he would live this life without interest. The system accepted his answer and wished him luck in his endeavor to become a peasant. And if the protagonist had any more questions, he could consult the system. After these words, the system said goodbye. William also said goodbye. He would contact the system if he needed anything. After a moment, the system just disappeared, and the protagonist is left alone with his thoughts. He looked very serious about it, seemed to even consider the words of the system. Suddenly, a snide smile appeared on his face, and he knew that although the system was very powerful, he had a plan to trick it. William realized to enter his next life as soon as possible. Then his goal in this life was to find an external way to fit the limitations so that he could be reborn. We moved to another location, a demonic school that had a tempestuous sect. Inside it, the fans of the sect gathered, and among them on the stage was the main woman who spoke to them. In return, she was wished to live forever. In her hand, she held a magic orb that was an extremely powerful weapon left behind by an ancient monk. The head of the sect was a pink-haired girl, with an extremely incredible figure of size, 3 at least. The girl knew that with the help of this magic orb, the sect would be able to approach the top of the demonic schools. As the girl envisioned her future and already saw what she would do with the sphere, fans around her exalted her and said, "Long live the Holy Almighty." But suddenly there was the sound of wind that was coming straight at the girl who was holding the magic orb. The orb disappears from his hands while the sect leader tries to hold on to them. She realized that the orb was missing from her hands and she needed it back immediately. The girl looked up. There was another girl standing on the roof of the building. She was all dressed in white and holding a magic orb in her hand. The mysterious girl was looking down and plotting something. The sect head knew her, so she was very angry and couldn't believe that her magic orb had been stolen. The girl, as a matter of fact, was also bragging about the fact that she now had a great power in her hand. In addition, she said to catch her if anyone could. This made the head of the sect very angry. To the men in black standing behind her, she ordered them to catch the thief and not let her escape under any circumstances. After that, we are transferred to the main character, or rather to his house where he lived. He lay on his bed and pondered how hard it would be for him to die without breaking the rules. Plus, he'd have to be very careful about it. Suddenly, his stomach rumbled. He grabbed it and realized he was hungry. He was very hungry, but didn't want to get out of bed. He continued to lie there, and it was hard for him to think. Especially dying of starvation was a violation of the rules. He wondered how he could find food in the mountains and forests. One of the options that came to his mind was hunting. Just then, a brilliant idea came to him. In his previous life, he spent every day at a desk working. How would he even know how to hunt? So he'd have to learn how to live. In this area, well, that was hard. Excited, he realized that there are so many dangers in hunting, such as being killed or eaten. He thought that within a week he would be following in the footsteps of his father's body. He didn't wait a second and immediately went hunting, hoping he would die from someone's paws or crash somewhere. In the depths of the forest, only the rustling of the trees could be heard. Our protagonist found what he was looking for. The boar was rushing at him with all its strength and speed to set its fangs on him. William froze at that moment. It would seem that this is the perfect plan to be reborn very quickly and become a king in another world. The boar that rushed at the boy was 10 times bigger than him, and he was already a couple of meters away from him. William was going to be on its fangs in no time. At the last moment, the guy got really scared, but he decided not to back down and continued to stand there with his pants full of bricks. But as soon as the boar's horns came close to the guy's face, the protagonist's eyes lit up blue, and his hands started moving on their own. The protagonist was surprised, because he didn't know how it was possible. He had practically accepted his death. A moment later, there was the sound of a squealing sound that the boar made. William tossed the boar overhead. William threw a carcass 10 times his own size through himself. The protagonist stood in a fetal position, not understanding what had just happened, because he had never possessed such extraordinary abilities. He assumed it was the muscle memory of the past owner of the case. After William defeated the big boar, the main character heard only birds singing around him. He had nothing to do but just go home, because he couldn't die. In despair, he came home. For a few minutes, there were no thoughts in his head at all, only the image of running a big boar through him. The protagonist, after thinking over everything that happened, made the verdict that he inherited such strong hunter skills and knowledge from his father. This fact caused him a wild rage because his plan to die in the wilderness was perfect. But everything went wrong, and now the protagonist will have to live half a century in this world. In a fit of rage, he wished that a stone would fall from the sky and smash his head. Evil William stood outside his house and waited for a stone to fly at him, but there was only silence in the neighborhood. But suddenly there was a huge explosion behind him, and he noticed it immediately. It looked like a huge meteorite had flown into his house. The protagonist did not expect such a turn of events. The roof of his house was destroyed, and he was shocked to see his nose runny and his body break into sweat. William was surprised and immediately rushed to the house. He did not believe that the stone really fell on him from the sky. The main character was upset because the stone did not hit him in the head. With lightning speed, he ran up to the house and immediately went inside. He didn't realize that inside the house was incredibly foggy from the dust, and visibility was poor. He tried to cover himself with his hand to see something. Then he saw the roof in ruins and the fallen boards. He was sure that his life was going through a bad patch, so he immediately began to rake up the ruins, for they would not clean themselves up if he stood and thought. While carrying the planks, he wondered where he would live now, because the floor of his house had been destroyed, and he did not know how to build. Suddenly, the protagonist was surprised by something. He noticed someone among the ruins. As he got closer, the guy's eyes almost fell out. In front of him was an incredibly beautiful but exhausted girl with white hair. The protagonist watched the girl long and intently and did not dare to come closer to her, but gathering all the courage in a fist, slowly but confidently headed towards the girl, looking at her from all sides. It looked very strange to the boy because a girl armed with a sword had fallen from the sky. William thought it was a cultivator from the legends. Her sword gave off a strange aura that William couldn't help but notice. Cautiously leaning over to her, he wasn't sure if the girl was alive. She continued to lie unconscious. William nonchalantly placed his head on her stomach to feel if her heart was beating. The guy realized that unfortunately he didn't find a heartbeat, and it looks like he had a dead body in the house. The protagonist was already thinking about how to get rid of it. The guy felt a little sorry for the girl. Suddenly, he turned his head towards her, and at this time she was intently already watching him. The protagonist didn't immediately realize what had happened. Goosebumps ran through his body. The girl was still staring intently but idly at the protagonist. This behavior scared the guy a lot, and he bounced a couple of meters away from her. In panic, he waved his hands away and tried to explain the whole situation. After all, he was just checking if she was alive or not. The unidentified girl, in a confused state, said only that she was in pain. In misunderstanding, the guy froze in place and waited for some explanation from the beautiful Da. Suddenly, a rock falls on the guy's head. Like he asked, but it doesn't kill him, it just hits him. After that, he and his girlfriend left the house. They could not stay there any longer, as it could collapse at any moment. The main character offered his help, and all he could do for her was try to heal her wounds. He wanted to go look for some medicinal herbs. He turned around and was disappointed, because he had not lived in this house for long. At that time, the girl started to take off her clothes. Then the mystery girl said there was nothing to find. Naturally, this caught the guy's attention, and he turned around to look at her, his gaze going to the girl's body. The guy's second stiffening was justified, because he didn't expect such an act from the girl. After he realized what he had just seen, he became very upset, so much so that his eyes flew out of his orbits. The girl didn't say anything and used some sort of ability. 2 white containers appeared above her hand. Naked, holding those flasks in her hand, she said she had a cure, but her body was too weak, so she called the protagonist a strong person and asked him to help her apply the cure. William's nose was bleeding and he was all red and embarrassed trying to take the medicine. The girl turned her back to the protagonist and said that cultivators didn't care about such obscene things. Then, standing over the girl, the guy said the girl was very brave in response. She said the main character was incredibly kind to her. As soon as the protagonist walked over to rub her back, he was surprised. The girl had severe cuts on her back as well as wounds, but the guy did not pay attention to it and began to rub the girl with healing ointment. Soon the bruises started to disappear on the places where the ointment had been applied, followed by cuts like nothing ever happened. The guy noticed that this medicine was so strong that he thought for a moment that it was an immortal salve. Once the guy finished rubbing the ointment on, the girl got dressed and said that how she got here was a long story. She was very grateful to the guy, so the girl immediately gave her name. Her name was Zoya. She was a cultivator from the sword school. The guy was so shocked by what was happening that he didn't immediately realize what she was talking about. But after a while, the shock more or less passed, and he also gave his name. Pointing his finger upwards, William asked, "How come a girl fell on his house from the sky?" Madam immediately began to tell her story. A few days ago, she learned that the demonic school's frenzy sect was plotting against the sword school. In order to stop them, she decided to eliminate the demonic guards, but she didn't have the strength. After that, they started to chase the girl and continued to do so all the way. She eventually fell and destroyed the protagonist's house. Zoya consoled William by telling him that once things got better, her school would make up for it. He was very much hurt by the girl's story, because one against the whole sect, standing aside, the girl did not understand why the guy's face twisted. William asked Mrs. Zoe what her plans of action were, to which the girl replied the demon school's plans have been stopped, and their artifact has been stolen. They're not giving up. There will be more attacks soon. She must urgently return to her sect and report it. But suddenly Zoya was overtaken by an incredible pain. She was leaning against a tree, because she became very sick and her mouth was bleeding. The guy noticed it and was very frightened. Standing behind her, he said her wounds were too serious. He was afraid she wouldn't make it if she continued on her way. The girl was extremely uncomfortable asking the guy for help, but she said that if he would help her and escort her to the sect, she would be very grateful for the help. The main character was very surprised by the girl's request, and he didn't even realize what it was about at first. The girl immediately started turning her head and telling him to forget what she said because it was too dangerous. But despite the girl's reaction, he asked how far away was the sect. Zoya reported that it would take them about half a month to reach her sect, and of course the demonic sect would follow them. They would be very lucky not to cross paths with the demonic sect. The boy immediately asked the system if it would be a violation of the rules if he died while escorting a beautiful girl, to which was immediately followed by the answer that peasants do not usually aspire to become heroes, but it was not against the rules if he had an accident and died on the road helping others. Zoya asked William once again if he was willing to accompany her. The protagonist pretended he was thinking, but at the same moment the guy pointed to himself, said it was okay, and he would help her. The girl did not expect such a response from the protagonist, and questioned that is he really going to help. On what he stood to her back answered, "Since Mrs. Zoya has done a valiant deed for the sake of ordinary people, and now she is for this, you are in the lion's den." And although the guy was mortal, he knew what he had to do, so he decided to help the girl to fight the demonic cult. Mrs. Zoya such words were shocked, and very much embarrassed. She knew that everything apparently, the main character lied. At the entrances of the Vanoyu looked not bad. Wondering what was going on, she immediately decided to forget about everything, because first it was necessary to reach the sect. Zoya, with her hand on her chest, asked if the protagonist was sure that he wanted to help her, to which the guy said that of course yes. Because of that, the girl should immediately thank him, because he was sure that he would be lucky. Zoya and the protagonist stood in the middle of the forest. She told him that they would have to work very hard, because the demonic cult in the lead was about to catch up with her. They should hurry to go on the road. The guy said that he was for it, but he had to pack his things. William realized that the wilderness wouldn't kill him, but if he encountered a few demonic cult men along the way, he'd probably find death faster than the guy expected. When he came to his father's grave, he said he would borrow his son's body for a while and let him die, and then he could rest in peace. After which he told Zoe that he was ready, and it was time to go on the road. The protagonist was serious. The joyful girl went after the guy. We moved to the demonic school where the head of the sect was standing, who cursed Zoya for ruining her 50-year plan. She created revenge and wanted her to pay for everything in full. The men in black stood in front of the girl and listened attentively to the mistress. The woman was addressing some man in black. He immediately stepped forward, all wrapped up in a black robe and also hiding his face under a white sheet, holding a stick in his hand. This was an elite of elites. The girl ordered you follow the elder of the sword school, Zoya, and must also return the magical artifact demonic school which Zoya stole. The mercenary told the saint not to worry because she could safely rely on his skills and leave all the dirty work to him. Suddenly, one of the saint's maids brought him some black magic artifact and told him to give his best because Zoya was extremely strong and he should not relax for a moment, so she gave him the artifact just in case. As soon as the elite tried to take it, he immediately felt an incredible emanating aura from the artifact. After a moment, he picked it up. It felt as if it had gone right through him, and he immediately realized what it was, and he couldn't believe that the saint was actually giving him this precious artifact. but with a horrified smirk, the girl informed him that it was only temporary. Standing in front of him, she said that if he could kill Zoya, that she would reward him. He began to thank her from the bottom of his heart, for she was truly a saint to him. The girl showed her true grin, for Zoya was not only seriously wounded but also struck by the soul-tracking incense. Deep in the night, by the beautiful light of the moon, a fire was burning deep in the forest with light bouncing off of it. Next to him rested our protagonist. While he was sweetly sleeping, someone started to approach him. He didn't even hear it, because a lot of different events happened today, and the guy slept without back legs. From the mouth drooled, because he saw a strong and rich sleep. Suddenly, an unknown hand reached out to him. Someone put a hand on the protagonist's stomach and started stroking. From such manipulations, the guy naturally woke up and was perplexed as to what was going on and who had disturbed his sound sleep. His eyes were still blurred, but he could make out the face and the sweat droplets on the TV. Blushing girl, her hand was on the main character's chest. The guy had a misunderstanding. His eyes were the size of watermelons, for he was surprised. From such actions, the main character's nose bled. He turned red and also did not know what to do. It seemed to him that everything was going too fast. The main character did not act. It was very exciting for the guys, but he couldn't let you dear viewers see very lewd footage. The girl's closed eyes went down to the protagonist's head, and she whispered one word, and that word was "let's." After this phrase, there was silence around them, and they lay in this pose for a few seconds, whereupon our protagonist traced with an understanding face all the blood and asked what it was. Zoya was sweating and breathing hard and told them to be careful because the ecstasy sect was just around the corner. William immediately caught on and shouted to the girl that she wasn't joking and started looking around asking how many there were. In response, she told the protagonist to be quiet. The guy himself had already started to sweat and was looking at the girl intently. Sitting on it, she said that he was alone and the man was very careful he didn't get close to them. However, instead he used an object witch's mount which belonged to the ecstasy sect. Being in this mist, all desires and emotions were awakened. She told the guy to look closely and he would see a red mist around them. The protagonist looked around, noticed a really unusual red mist, and it came to him that if it was true that just because he had been seduced by this mist, it was as if in the 18+ manhwa. He was incredibly surprised. But then he remembered that once upon a time, he himself had read a pointless story, sometimes almost losing his head to them. But he decided to let that awkward moment go. Zoya interrupted the main character's thoughts by telling him about the witch's mountain item that only worked on girls, and he was in no danger. Our guy was in a stupor as usual. Suddenly the girl plops down on the floor. Were we naturally worried? And he asked, or was she okay? The girl was already exhausted and replied that she could resist for a while longer. Poor Immediate helped Zoya up, holding her at a distance by the shoulders, while around them was the same fog that was increasingly weakening the girl. As soon as they got up, the guy immediately shook off the dust and wondered what they were going to do. The girl barely replied that they have two options. First, she has her trump card, but it would be too risky. The protagonist looked at the girl in surprise because he didn't understand what the plan was. She went on to say that if she used it, she would definitely kill their enemy. But she could also kill the guy himself. We're lit up with happiness because that's what he needed. In his head, he just wanted the girl to use her trump card. All blushing, Zoya barely kept from her desires, and told the guy that she did not think that the main character would agree, and she herself cannot let the man who saved her to die in this way. Naturally, he did not like it, because he only needed it to die, and he agreed in his head to everything. His hair began to stand on end from such an answer of the girl. With a dead stare, the girl said that there was also a second option. It was that Poor had to find the person who was hiding, and used a magic item on her. Jana would kill him herself. The guy didn't point his finger and got confused and said, did the girl really want him to find it? Zoya looked at his hands. I answered that he was using a magic item to hide his presence, and now the girl was distracted, so she couldn't find it herself. But the guy grew up in the forest, and most likely he could find it. William, the girl's plan, was very much embarrassed, and his displeasure was displayed on his face. The girl said it would be very difficult for him, but it was the only way for him to survive. The main character smiled happily, looking at her breasts. He said that he himself realized it, and he would definitely find the person who was following him. But in his mind, he knew that his time had come, and now he would be able to move to another manhwa where he would already be incredibly strong with the system. While they weren't talking, there was a shadow deep in the woods watching them. It was the same man in an invisible robe who was hiding behind a tree and eavesdropping on their conversation. After all, the vestment that he wore was given to him by the saint, and it could not only protect the man from spiritual search, but also hide him from all 5 senses. And even if the girl and the protagonist find him, they wouldn't be able to touch the man in the invisible robe to determine who he was. It was a perfect advantage for him. His plan was that he wanted to wait for the Witch Mountain to affect Zoya, and then he would make his move and kill her. It was very difficult for him, and he could only wait. He began to think that killing the girl in this way was quite unfortunate, and if the girl could gather yin and nourish yang, it would not only be blissful, but she could also gain yin and speed up her cultivation. Also, the girl had the treasure of the ecstasy sect, and the mercenary was thinking about what to eat and could get the item, then maybe get a decent reward. Suddenly, from behind a tree appeared our protagonist. The man invisible little did not understand where the spill came from. He began to assume that he had spotted him. In turn, the boy only looked around holding his bow. Noticing as the protagonist looked around, he realized he was just trying to find him. But for the man in black, it was simply unthinkable, since the one who was looking for him to be a mere mortal, and he couldn't just pick up on the changes in the air. While William continued to look for the man who was following them, he stood behind a tree and pondered that, despite what he assumed, he was manipulating the air currents to make it appear that he was south of them, when in fact, he was in the north. So it was simply impossible for the guy to find him. Once again, the invisible man wanted to peek out from behind the tree to once again watch the protagonist and his actions. But as soon as he sticks his head out to look, an arrow comes at him with incredible speed and he manages to spot it right in front of his eye. With magic, the man in black deflects the attack. Somehow he managed to break the arrow that flew off to the side. The mercenary was too surprised and couldn't believe that he was revealed. His plan was ruined and his position was revealed. And also the main character was also incredibly surprised because he didn't expect such a thing from you, opened his mouth and froze on the spot. Holding his head by his head, opening his mouth, he began to wonder how he could so easily manage to hit the invisible man. 15 minutes ago, a guy wandering through the woods with a bow noticed that it was foggy and coming from the south, which meant only one thing, that his enemy had to be there. So he decided to shoot to the north to be sure to miss. And having taken aim, the protagonist knew that the shot had to pass out of range of Zoe's defenses. So drawing his bow, he knew that he had to shoot at places that were not covered by branches or leaves. William had a plan. After he shot, he would have to go pick up the arrow, naturally head north, after which the enemy would appear behind him. And while he's picking up the arrow, he'll attack him from behind and kill him. The guy started crying because his plan was very well prepared, and he didn't understand why he was exactly where he shot. Kneeling on his knees, pouring tears, the guy had lost all hope of dying because it was his only chance. Now that he had found the man who was following them, the Zoya would not let him go. After the guy came to his senses and raised his head, he saw him run away right in front of his nose, hiding behind the trees. He began to wonder why this happened. Turning around, he saw that Ms. Zoya hadn't moved at all. She was frozen in a stupor from the guy's piercing stare. Moving closer to her, he asked why she didn't do anything. She was very embarrassed and shaking so much that she was steaming. With difficulty, she replied that her injury was still strong, and attacking the man who was following them would make it worse, so the girl thought she would wait for the protagonist to find him. But she didn't expect him to be up to the task so quickly. So, grabbing his hand and squeezing it tightly, from the fact that the girl took his hand, he knew where this was going and tensed up very much. Zoya asked the protagonist to find that man again, and this time she promised she wouldn't let him go. The guy was picking up on how strong the magic item was acting on the girl, and that she wasn't in control of herself. So wrenching his arm from her grasp, he said he would do his best, and ordered her to just wait. The protagonist armed himself with his bow again, and this time he understood that he wouldn't be able to hit the man in the invisible robe like that again, and that was a fluke. The mercenary also assumed that it was just a fluke, and this time the protagonist would not and could not get in. Their thoughts were exactly the same and carried the same message. The invisible man was moving at an incredible speed in the moonlight. The man in black eventually landed in the same position where he was before. He still continued to watch the main character's son of Zoe talk as well. The protagonist made his promise that he would find the man following them and aimed his bow again, at the same position where the man following them had been the first time. William reasoned that the man who was following them was not stupid enough to make a circle and return to the original position, so he was 100% sure he would miss this time. Then they released the bow net and the arrow hits the mercenary directly in the head, which immediately confused him. The protagonist was furious, as well as the mercenary who was following them, because he didn't understand how this was possible. Then the pattern repeated itself, and the trailing man hit again between the trees. The guy in turn just watched these. With a disgruntled face, the guy turned around to look at the girl. At the same moment, a chill ran through his body. He calmly asked what was wrong with her not having enough time to attack him again. Zoya just covered her embarrassed face with her hands and said that the guy was too fast, and she didn't have time to react. But suddenly, the girl's eyes became serious. She looked at the guy and jumped up. She started to summon her sword. Her palm was enveloped in purple energy. Then in her hands appeared a sword. The girl was all exhausted, and stood leaning on the sword, but said that she was ready to fight. Zoya wiped the blood that was on her face, and said that she would not let this year get away from them anymore, and as soon as the main characters found him, she would kill him immediately. Vileem noticed the girl's determination, and realized she wouldn't make another mistake. The boy looked deep into the woods with a serious look, but pleaded to himself that the man in black would not let the man hit him again. The mercenary, again moving through the forest, knew that Zoe's medication was about to take effect, so she would soon recover. He had one last chance to kill her, and it didn't matter to the mercenary if he lived or died, but he had to try. The protagonist began to aim somewhere, thinking where to shoot, so as not to hit the mercenary. The latter in turn thought about where to hide. The guy had an incredibly well-developed intuition, because wherever the mercenary went, he was always aiming at him. William thought that it was dangerous to shoot everywhere. The mercenary's thoughts were exactly the same, that hiding everywhere was also dangerous. So the protagonist decided he had to shoot where he 100% wasn't hiding, and he was serious about it. The mercenary also rolled around so much that he has to hide where the guy won't hit him. So the man in black decided to soar just above him and finish it all off with one punch, hoping that he got caught. But the protagonist decided that the mercenary 100% will not hide above him, and so he can miss, so he aimed in the sky almost at the moon. After the shot, the arrow flew at an incredible speed, and it was only 2 centimeters away from the mercenary, and he didn't have time to react. At that moment, the man watching them only had 2 thoughts: that he actually saw him and was pretending to play with him. The mercenary thought about how mean and unconscionable it was. A moment later, an arrow flew straight into his face, and he was immediately confused. William was already running out of patience, and thought the mercenary had lost his mind as he jumped right on his arrow. But suddenly the protagonist, as if struck by lightning, he froze for a second on the spot and put himself on the thought that whether the mercenary also had a system that needed his death, so he rushed at the protagonist arrow. This time Zoya didn't slow down, and just as the opportunity to strike struck, she rushed in to attack. Getting as close to the mercenaries as possible, she swung her katana with an incredible purple aura. The girl wanted to finish everything in one blow, so she was very serious and said just one phrase before she struck. This phrase was die. The mercenary still tried something to counter the girl and activated the electric protective field. But it was too late, as the girl had recovered enough to pierce his worthless defense. The column went through the barrier like butter on a knife without even feeling any resistance. With incredible force, a direct strike from the katana sends the mercenary flying straight into the rib. From the speed of the attack, he only had time to see the air cut from the force of the katana he flew at him with. There was an incredible explosion in the sky of bright purple Shounen aura that the girl used against the mercenary. The protagonist stood amazed, as it was the first time he had been able to observe something so unusual and marvelous. For a moment the guy just froze, drops of sweat rolling down his face. A moment later, the mercenary fell unseated and defeated to the floor. He was immediately followed by a young girl who defeated the arrogant mercenary who thought he could defeat them. The protagonist walked closer to the unconscious man in black, lying bleeding from the head down. He said he had a couple questions, and one of them was why he kept jumping on his arrows. The exhausted mercenary couldn't string 2 words together, but the guy's phrasing made him very angry. William looked at him with a pitying look, and added that he really just wanted to die. The mercenary saw more and more the light at the end of the tunnel. His anger also had no limit, but he could not answer the guy. A second later, the killer in black vomited blood through the bandages he was wrapped in. The protagonist noticed that he was bleeding heavily. As if out of spite, he asked him if he was okay, while OK had already passed out and couldn't answer anything. William's nerves began to give out, and he took him by the collar and told him not to die, and told him something, because he had many more questions for the attacker. But after that anger, the protagonist calmed down as he noticed that he was approached by Mrs. Zoya, who asked if she was okay and whether it was recent to remove the gun from her hands. The protagonist stood up and started to approach the girl. She replied that she was fine, and added that the ecstasy sect were testing their abilities because they had sent a weak mercenary, and next time they would send them someone stronger, so they should always be ready. The girl replied, glowing. The protagonist asked her a question that carried the following character. There were still quite a few ways to which they could go to get to the sword sect, so the guy wondered how the mercenary knew that they had chosen this particular path. The girl blushed and said that there was something she hadn't told the protagonist, namely that because of her injury she might die if they didn't get to the recognized location within half a month. The main characters started to listen attentively without interrupting the girl. Zoya told that Zania Mecha had only 3 routes that will lead them there in such a time, and the ecstasy sect knows about it, and that they have no other choice but to choose one of the 3 routes. Zoya lowered her gaze down, She said that if the guy regretted agreeing and wanted to leave, she wouldn't blame him for it. She looked up at him and saw the smile on his face. William told her not to say that because he had promised to bring her back to the cult. She was halfway there and he couldn't refuse. In his mind, he knew she could relax because he would be around until he died. Suddenly the girl grabbed the guy's head, and she threw him into her warm embrace because she was so grateful to him. The guy, not expecting it at first, didn't resist, but after a moment he couldn't breathe. So he pulled out of her embrace and said it wasn't really appropriate. The girl blushed and realized what she had done, so she said that the Witch Mountain was still affecting her and asked the protagonist to leave for a while. After all, she wanted to get rid of the action of the Witch Mountain, but for a girl it wasn't very comfortable when someone was around. Somehow that night some incredible things happened. We moved to the head of the ecstasy sect, she as expected from the elder of the sword sect that will kill her mercenary, without straining. The girl took only about one thing, that lost in vain, a valuable artifact. Looking at the map where the red dots were marked, the girl sect leader had set there for the protagonist, and Zoe traps with her servants. She wondered if they would be able to defeat their servants just as easily. After some time, our protagonist and his girlfriend arrived at their destination because the cult of pleasure did not send a killer after them. As the protagonist entered the city, he thought that even though Zoya looked like an innocent girl, she had a huge fighting potential. Suddenly, the guy asked the girl why they stopped in a small town if their goal was a sword cult. The girl explained that they came to the city of Zenon because their people were guarding the entrance to the Siden. The girl continued to explain to the protagonist what was going on. As they walked through the city, she said that the sword cult was in the vassal district of Sidon. The city of Zenon was on the western border of Sidon, protecting the entrance. So since the girl was injured, they would have to cross Zenon to get to Sidon. The guy listened carefully and looked at the map. The map showed a clear view of their route. William immediately understood everything, but now that they were near the sword cult, he wondered if the pleasure cult would dare to pursue them. The girl with a serious look told the guy that the Wen sword cult was the biggest school, so the pleasure cult wouldn't dare to challenge them. Us also, the Demon Academy, wouldn't miss their chance to become stronger, and Zoya was sure that they were sending another mercenary after them. The protagonist was getting more and more excited that things were getting dangerous, and he only expected the pleasure cult to come after him, for his body was in anticipation of their sword. William and Zoe went to find a place to sleep. Come evening, they rented a room for two. The girl went to take a bath while gum ice shone through the wooden slab. Watching all of this was a guy who was standing on their hands with his nose bleeding incessantly. Suddenly, the all-naked girl runs out of the bathtub with the words that the people of the pleasure cult were very near. They need to urgently prepare for battle. The main character was already in a bad way. And about Zoe's action, he lost his balance and his blood gushed after what he saw. He slumped to the floor completely exhausted. The guy lay at the girl's feet bleeding, wondering how they could have come so fast, trying to ignore the fact that the girl was completely naked. Zoya said she could sense them, so they needed to get ready right away. She threw a towel over herself. Wrapped in a towel behind her, watched the guy who only had the thought in his head that she was too susceptible. Zoya didn't wait, and immediately used magic. Her whole hand was covered in purple energy. She pulled her katana from the ring. Paid wrapped in a towel, she was ready for battle, and would say want her enemies. She already knew who she had attacked them and called their names. It was Lloyd and Jack, the protagonists, brooding about how they're really called that. The guy in his head was going through the same thought, that how could the girl know their names? If it was all by hearing, he only concluded that cultivators were amazing people. Suddenly the doors opened very loudly. Naturally, the protagonist Zoya, pay attention to this guy from fear, took in his hand a chair that would at least something to defend themselves. In the doorway stood 4 people. 3 of them were men, and 4. Stella in the middle was an elderly woman. She said they were honored that the girl remembered their names after so many years, then laughed. The old lady said that she recalled how the girl had killed every poor person, and those who hurt them badly they never forget. In response, Zoya just smiled and said that does she really think they are poor people? She said don't make her laugh. These 4 people, the girl began to tell the story. One elderly grandmother was the mother of 5 poisons. She poisoned the river to stop the plague. 2 was a faceless monk who killed people and then disfigured their faces. The 3rd person was incredibly terrifying. His name was Lin. He ate children in order to, besides physically cultivating his soul, to also cultivate. And concluding 4 was a Naga, who used mortals as fodder for shadow monsters. The girl finished telling the story of each of them, pointed her sword at them, and said that they were incredible hypocrites, while the main character stood silently aside and digested all the information. And at one point it was like he was struck with horror because plague and cannibalism were inappropriate things for the protagonist. Their conversation was interrupted by the clatter of sticks, and the mother of 5 Yadam suddenly shouted out, and the son with incredible fury, that mortals were nothing compared to cultivators. She didn't care at all that the girl didn't babble. The old woman said that there was no way she would let Zoya go. Zoya said she didn't want to waste time with her and wanted to fight. She grabbed a towel and was about to throw it off. Suddenly, the main character swung his chair with an incredible scream and told them to die and headed towards them. But the very towel that the girl had taken off flew into the guy's face and stopped him, interrupting his heroic phrase. Because of what you, Ilium became furious at him. Wild blood demolition. He began to say that Zoya should not undress when I want them. Because of her, they could be kicked out. In addition, she has not yet fully recovered. The guy offered to fight instead of her. He went over to her and told her that Pana had done a towel. She was surprised, so she did, and said she wouldn't mind. The grandmother thoughtfully put her hand to her face and asked the protagonist if he really wanted to fight in the center of the zenith. Then she added that if they all used their power together at the same time, many mortals would suffer, and even more could die. Guys, it is very much strained because the grandmother did not even pay attention to his words. He asked her a question whether So was deaf, because he said that fight instead of a girl. Zoya, standing aside, did not say anything and just kept silent. The old woman pointed at the guy and asked the girl if the mortal beside her could protect the girl. Then she smiled, not believing in the guy's strength. The protagonist glossed over the conversation and told her not to worry about it because he would take care of it. The grandmother called him shameless, standing in front of Zoe while she asked what they wanted from her. Suddenly, a terrifying atmosphere appeared near the old woman, and she replied that everything was simple. The girl had to pass their test. If she copes, then they will no longer attack her, and that would be all fair. Mother 5 Poison offered to use the technique of connecting souls, the essence of which was that when the souls connect, it is like a confirmation of the contract. If any of them break the contract, it will immediately follow the punishment of the soul of the violator, immediately die. After a couple minutes of silence and standing looking at each other like that, Bobka asked what Zoya thought about this contract. Bobka, with an incredibly pensive face, thought in his head that their foursome Zoe was not even a match for this contract. But it was worth a try and they had no other choice. While next to Zoya stood silent protagonist, did not understand how could be so idiotic not to realize that it was a trap. And in general, the guy did not understand how they wanted to fool them because everything was clear and lay on the surface. But the girl replied that she agreed, thus almost killing the main character in the background who had a nosebleed. He came up to her and whispered in her ear that she should think about it again, because they were definitely not to be trusted, and the guy suggested to just give up this contract. There was nothing wrong with it. The girl seemed to hear the guy. She replied that she knew it all herself, but she didn't want him or the people of the town to die for her, so she agreed to the contract. William was very much surprised by this, though that was to be expected from such an experienced fighter. Coming closer to the mother of 5 poisons, they began to conclude a contract in which it was said that today Zoya signs an agreement with the mother of 5 poisons, 1,000 pieces, faceless monk, as well as naked and the creation of the test, whether Zoya will pass all 4 tests. Creators of the test in never attack her. It was the condition of Zoya. In case of violation of the contract, the soul of the guilty will be destroyed. The protagonist stood to the side and watched as the girl was about to sign this contract. Well, all of a sudden, William noticed something as if it had gotten through to him. He was looking at that contract with misunderstanding, and when he noticed the old woman's face, he immediately realized there was a catch, so he decided to stop them from making a deal. He pulled the girl aside. She was shocked she didn't realize what was going on, as the guy interrupted them signing the contract. The grandmother and the monk were very tense because they didn't understand what was going on and why the main character was getting into their agreement. Vilum started to say that the girl can't see that in this contract there was no text of the rules, so they could do whatever the girl wanted to do. For example, kill the head of her clan. There was also one of the options that the poison wouldn't kill the girl or the result wouldn't suit them, and they would blackmail her with people's lives. That really pissed the guy off because there were too many holes in that contract for him to sign. With just one blow, he rips up the contract and says all they have to do is get her to sign, Zoya standing silently aside. The protagonist smilingly knew he basically had to die, but he couldn't stand by when the girl was being fooled. If really needed a contract for them, he would make sure it was well written. Such bold behavior made the mother of the 5 poisons very angry. She said, "How dare an ordinary mortal interfere with them?" And the protagonist was frightened by the expression on the grandmother's face, hiding behind Zoe. He started pointing his fingers at her, and saying that she was scared and threatening people with death. The grandmother was even more angry, and she said not to listen to him because he was trying to ruin her reputation. The girl naturally took the guy's side, and smiling, she said what kind of reputation the grandmother was talking about if she didn't have one. The guy stood smugly behind the girl and poked the grandmother in the face with his middle finger as the girl took his side. Zoya gave an ultimatum: either they change contracts or they would fight, and she would be prepared to face the consequences. Suddenly they gathered in a group and began to discuss what they should do, because they couldn't fight here, because they would lose 100%. They began to discuss whether they could change the contract and still win. The guy listening to them heard that one of them refused to fight because he knew it was certain death. Everyone paid attention to him and asked him what he was so afraid of, because if you don't try not to find out. But he still refused. Then the three of them were angry with Four because he did not want to agree, and threw him aside to come to his senses. The protagonist watching them became embarrassed. Once the matter was settled among them all, the mother of the 5 poisons said that since they were so excited, they would change the contract. Well, the guy said it was good, and first he wanted to make a couple of amendments to the contract. One quirk it was that the test was not to exceed the skills of all 4. Also, he added that in passing the test, they were not to die or get badly hurt. The guy didn't know what their confidence was saying, that they were seriously prepared, because if there was a different situation, Zoe wouldn't have had to sign. With a satisfied smirk on his face, the guy called his 3 conditions: that, after passing their test, they had to go to a deserted land, not to interfere in the affairs of ordinary people, but also, the protagonist did not want to touch the component of the test, because he had to help Zoe, after which, if necessary, to die quietly. After saying 3 conditions, Mother 5, I gave the mother realized that the protagonist of them figured out, because he wanted to talk the girl out of signing the contract by all means. Babka had nothing left to do but to agree to his conditions, as she was sure that the girl still will not pass their test in any case. Also, the guy said he wants to carry his name on the contract next to the girl's. Pointing at the protagonist with a stick and laughing loudly, the grandmother said that he was wrong to interfere in their contract because he was just a stupid mortal and he would regret it. The guy here had one thought that he could regret only if he did not sign this contract. After all the questions and edits were clarified, the mother of 5 poison began to spell contract. A terrifying aura emanated from her, and silver magic flew near her hands. In front of everyone, there was a contract with edits, and with the fact that if Zoya and William pass the test, the 4 will go to a deserted island in the west for 10 years, and will have no contact with people and with the outside world in general. Suddenly, behind the guy, a girl said worriedly that he shouldn't have interfered in their fight, which surprised the guy. Then the guy smiled and said that if the 4 of them signed a contract together, they should have done it together. While the girl stuck by the main character of the words, you didn't know what to say back to him. The guy in his head was unrealistically happy, because he knew that once they signed the contract, it was nothing short of a death sentence for him, and he was obligated to sign it. The protagonist did not hesitate to immediately sign the contract, while behind him stood a girl, and thought that she really has a partner because she always worked alone. Especially, he was just a mortal, but she knew that he wanted to fight with her side by side. So with these thoughts, she also signed the contracts below him, and said that she would not let him die under any circumstances, and would protect him. After signing them, the main character started warming up and asked what kind of tests they had there. He couldn't wait to see it, so he asked them to show it quickly. The mother of the 5 poisons replied that the test was meant for cultivators. This was not at all concerning to a mortal, to which William replied with a smile that his name was signed on the contract, which meant that he had to be able to pass it, especially since they wanted to fool Miss Zoe, so the boy wanted to help her. Then asked the foursome a question that, if they were afraid of losing Hay. The words of the protagonist struck the girl harder and harder. She was already all red and happy, and that she had rubbed a guy like him. While the grandmother was greatly angered by his words, she trembled with anger and even grabbed the white-robed grandfather standing next to her by his beard. Then she started yelling at him that he was a hypocritical asshole and that he really wanted to die quickly, if that was the case. She told him to come to her, and she would arrange it for him. The grandmother did not notice that she was pulling the grandfather by the beard, who was begging her to stop. Each of them started calling their test. Stage 1 naturally was the mother of 5 poisons test. It's called poisoned wine. To pass it, they had to drink 3 glasses. 2 test was a bearded grandfather, who because of the fact that the grandmother pulled his beard, it hurt him very badly. On his test was much easier than the mother of 5 poisons. The essence of you was that they had to just play with him. The test of the faceless monk was to debate. And last in line was the man who summoned the shadow beasts. His test was that the guys had to stay near the shadow beasts for an hour and a half without dying. These poisons pointing fingers at the protagonist girl told the fools to pick 3 tests out of 4. Our protagonist naturally volunteered first, and as soon as he wanted to choose a test, Zoya grabbed his arm. B said that she was very grateful to the guy, but she had to cope on her own, because it was a game of survival. The main character's eyes went to his forehead because of the girl's actions. His surprise was not limited. Afterward, he expressed his displeasure, for he had tried so hard, and the girl was about to ruin all his plans, to which the girl continued to insist and say that William's body was too weak and he could die. She was not afraid to let it go. In such words, he was simply amazed. But suddenly the realization began to come to him that he had almost forgotten that if he tried too hard to die, the system would count it as suicide and not give him the power. The guy turned his back to the 4 from what they did not understand what was happening to him. But at that moment, the main character told the system to wake up because he needed her help. Immediately, a lightning bolt appeared in front of his eyes and opened the system. The protagonist told the system that he decided to sign a contract to take the test. Then he asked that if there is any will die during the test, it will be a situation like suicide. The system said it would count as a heroic act. If death is not predetermined by the system, it will not count as a suicide. The guy exhaled with relief at the same second, because he only had to convince Zoya to participate in the test. Since Zoya stood firm in her opinion, the guys had nothing to do but use stealth. He spoke to her and said that it seemed Zoya thought he was as useless as a foursome. And did she really think he wouldn't pass the test? The girl immediately turned to him and turned her attention to him, but without saying anything, she just listened to him. But the guy had already given Shadows his back and said that for all the time he thought they had become friends, and the main character had signed the contract for Zoe's sake. He also added that she apparently still saw him as a mere mortal even after all he had done for her. From the girl's side, it seemed that she had offended the protagonist very much from what he even got down. But the girl's look showed that she didn't want to do that. As an aside, Mother 5 Yadam and the bearded grandfather only scoffed from this scene, and even grabbed some popcorn to watch such passions. The main character Baseball was trembling, and said nothing while Zoya waited for him to respond. But suddenly the guy turned to her and with incredible grace said that she does not listen to her, so he will participate in the test. The surprise of the girl could not be conveyed in words. About such a quick action facial expression, she could not say anything. She was pierced through. From this turn of events, even the couple who was watching with popcorn dropped it and did not understand what was happening. And for a moment there was a moment of stupor and silence. As soon as the guy wanted to approach the girl, she immediately drove him away and told him to leave her to go fulfill the test. The protagonist achieved what he wanted. He thought that he perfectly fulfilled his role and achieved what he wanted. The first test he decisively chose was the mother poison test. William had a plan. He wanted to take the glass where the wine was poisoned. It was a quick and efficient way to die and achieve his goal. If it wasn't for the rules of the system about suicide, he would have already drunk all the glasses. Mother 5 Poisons didn't think long and placed the glasses in front of him. Then said the condition that they should choose a glass from each row. In total, should not drink 3 glasses, and then the test will be considered passed. As said by the rules, not all glasses were poisoned. They had to use their abilities to determine the day there was no poison. Standing in front of the glasses, the guy thought about which one he should choose, because he can't choose all the uncorrected ones at random. Coming closer and leaning towards them, he took a closer look, and remembered that maybe he was chasing his luck, because that time when he was being followed by an invisible guy, he just hit 3 times. But the thought that he should be more careful did not leave the protagonist. To the guy in his eyes, the first 3 glasses looked like plain water, and he couldn't see any differences. Then, without thinking about it, he took 1 glass and tasted it, and concluded that the taste of the water in the glass was not different. He wondered how to determine that he had drunk poisoned water. Taking the second glass, the guy looked at it and realized that the liquid in it looked suspicious. Suddenly something happened to him like a bolt of lightning. After that, William couldn't control himself. His legs went numb as well as his hands, his mouth watering. And a moment later, suddenly he fell to the floor uncontrolled himself. Zoya left it at that, and immediately asked if the guy was okay as long as he lay there, and didn't move. But after a second, the main character replied that he was fine, and he was fine. The mother of 5 poisons was happy, because they were closer and closer to victory, and she was surprised that the guy had such a reaction. After just 1 sip, she had already forgotten that she was not in her clan, so she told William to surrender. At that time, William got to his feet, though he was shaking all over, and said he was all right, leaning on the table. But in his mind, he was thinking that the stronger I was, the easier it was for him to die. With a trembling hand, he was about to reach for the third glass, but remembered that he hadn't finished the second one yet. Grabbing the second glass, he was about to drink it completely, and when he picked it up, he accidentally spilled a single drop. The drop fell on the table and burned it through. The guy's reaction naturally did not have to wait long. He immediately bulged his eyes from surprise at how incredibly powerful the poison was. Once more, he glanced at the glass with a penetrating look, a drop of sweat rolling down his face. But then it didn't take long for him to smile and realize that he had found what he was looking for in just a moment, and he would reach his goal. Undeterred, he drank it knowing what would happen to him. As he waited for his death around him, Vitaly had obsessive thoughts and an incredible intimidating aura of death. He was just waiting for it. 2,000 hours later, he opened his eyes and was completely unharmed, not understanding why. The mother of the 5 poisons said that he was smarter than she thought, because he realized that 1,000 dry trees are made of a harmless plant, but corrosive. She asked to tell the guy who trained him to recognize poison. The main character was very angry. He almost boiled with rage, because he did not understand how plants can be so bright and harmless at the same time. He thought about the fact that whether in this world there were no rules at all. The mother of the 5 poisons interrupted the guy's thoughts and asked why he was silent, if he was afraid of hurting the master, then warned him not to worry because she wouldn't touch him if he even said his name. But the guy exhaled with difficulty and said that it wasn't about that at all. How she couldn't understand since he didn't have a teacher and hadn't studied any poisons. But the grandmother did not insist that the protagonist tell the name of his teacher and told them to come and continue the trial. The tumblers standing in front of him made the guy think believe. In round 1, the mother of 5 poisons made the safe option look the most dangerous. He couldn't believe that that drink didn't kill him. In the second trio of glasses, the protagonist reaches for the most innocuous-looking glass. But internally, I gave him a lapis and told him the incredible was coming, and didn't he realize? Suddenly, the guy began to realize that he really has sawdust in his head, because it was obvious that it was impossible to choose one glass, because the mother of 5 poisons did not use the same method as last time. It was different in the guy's eyes. He decided to choose the most dangerous one-look glass. So he decided to choose a glass with a black liquid that didn't even have light bouncing off it. But suddenly, his left hand grabbed his right hand. The guy began to think about what is, and she will come to guess his move out of planned everything just so, and actually poured poison into the most ordinary mug. For the main character, the choice was too tense and unclear because the guy did not know where she poured the long-awaited poison. And now the guy had a new thought that the mother of the 5th poison could foresee that the protagonist wouldn't be able to choose between the 1st and 3rd poison, and actually sent the 2nd. The guy was frozen in a stupor and he didn't know what to choose and trembled in thought. The fact that he was undecided, he was very angry because he could not tolerate for centuries. He needed to die soon. His head was filled with thoughts only about where she could slip the poison. "We continue to look closely at the 3 glasses," he cried, because he didn't know what to choose, and asked for thoughts, remind relics. As soon as the guy wanted to reach for the purple liquid in the background, the mother of 5 poisons didn't give any sign, and stood just watching the protagonist's choice. The protagonist changed his mind to take the purple-colored liquid, and decided to take the black one. As immediately the grandmother began to frown, and it naturally noticed the spill. He picked up the glass with the black liquid and wondered that since she was frowning at the glass with the black liquid, maybe it meant that the poison was in her. With every second, as the guy held the glass of black water, the mother of 5 poisons stared at him intently and frowned more and more. The guy realized by the look of the broad that it was a glass without poison, so he decided not to drink it and put it on the table. Since he needed an accidental death, he knew that no matter which glass he chose, 1 or 2 would have poison in both. The protagonist, glowing with joy, drank the liquid as he thought garden. And in his thoughts, he was flying only one thing, that how good it was that he was careful, because he almost chose the wrong glass that he needed. As soon as the guy finished the entire glass to the end, the mother of 5 poisons asked him if he was really so good that he was able to identify the only glass in which there was no poison. In addition, she said that his master was really a real good man. At first, the main character held back tears and remained silent with no look on his face. Zoya noticed this and naturally wondered what was wrong because William had chosen the right glass. No matter how hard the protagonist tried to hold back the tears, they still flowed. He was shaking because he was very much offended, and inside he only wondered why it was happening to him, and how it is possible that his choice always served on a glass without poison. In the end, the guy could not stand it and snapped at the grandmother and asked why she only in front of him. She smirked as if not in himself. Did she really decide to play with him? He warned her that she was with him carefully. Vita not that he could and denounce her. The mother of 5 Yads did not immediately understand what happened and why the guy snapped at her. Once she digested all the information, she also yelled at Sky in response, and said that he was too dumb since he was thinking for a very long time he naturally hung her out. So she smirked. If it wasn't for the cultivator behind his back, she would have already killed him 3 times. Their argument was interrupted by Zoya, who praised William for knowing so much about poisons. To be honest, she said that she didn't even believe that the guy would pass the test. So she decided to cheer him up because he only had 1 cup left. After her words, he turned to her, all in tears, holding a glass in his hand. From him emanated a sad aura, and inside the guy thought only that the girl did not cheer him up because she makes it worse for him. Zoya did not understand what was the matter and looked at the guy in surprise. Turning around to face her, he said he would try, even though he was in tears, and from anger he almost burst the cup in his hand, which he was clutching with incredible strength. The girl noticed that there was something wrong with her boyfriend. She asked if he was okay. This time, the guy looking at the cups realized that the harder he thought, the worse he felt. So he decided to just drink and pointed his hand towards the green cup because it was his choice, and promptly drank it without a word, hoping it was poison. After he drank, he noticed that the liquid was incredibly sweet and like mineral water. The guy already thought that he had chosen a cup without poison again. But suddenly something confused him, and after a moment he began to spit blood, his stomach incredibly twisted, and the guy himself felt incredibly bad. Zoya was horrified by what she saw, and immediately went to the main character. And the mother of 5 poisons was incredibly happy. On her face was a devilish smile that she did not even try to hide because the main character chose a glass of poison. She said that this time, the guy will die. While the main character was kneeling at Zoe's feet, she pointed her finger at the mother of the 5 poisons and asked what she had done with them, to which she smirked and said that even though the protagonist had chosen correctly before, he would have gotten us the last drink wrong anyway. With an incredibly pleased face, she said there was poison in all of them, and laughed very silly. Then the mother of the drink explained that the protagonist chose 1 glass, then 3, and finally 2. But only by drinking the contents of each glass, the guy will be able to eliminate all the toxins. And this was the only way. Kneeling in front of her, the grandmother told him all this, and finally told him that he had no more than 2 hours left. The protagonist rose up. On his face was blood and sweat, and his eyes were glassy red, and looked at the grandmother, asked if it was definitely poison, because he felt no pain. If he felt no pain for him, it meant that he was in the line. The mother of 5 poisons waved her hand, saying that his body had been relieved the last hours. Then there was 1 plus in the poison. The protagonist looked at the 5 poison grandmother with a glassy look, and said that it was great, and inside he was incredibly happy, because after so many days he could finally die, now born in another world with incredible power. The mother of 5 poisons, it is very much strained all sides. William drank poison and sat laughing. It was quite strange, but undecided not to dwell on it, or decided to just ignore it. Because really, who should pay attention? It was Zoya. After all, she was the main target. The mother of the 5 Ayaks started to turn to Zoya, who was incredibly shocked by what had happened, and had not yet come to the point where she could understand anything. She asked her if she still had to take the 3 tests. She was already alone. But the girl did not have time to answer anything, as suddenly their conversation was interrupted by the main character. The guy poked his middle finger in the direction of the woman and said that Tani had written him off from the shields because he was still alive. He had 2 hours to spare, so he was going to take another test, namely a board game. In fact, it was not any heroism, but just the protagonist wanted to be sure that he would die 100%. So he wanted to squeeze all the juices out of himself. And so it was game time. And with incredible speed, they rearranged black-white pieces, no give each other a rest. The protagonist was satisfied with the fact that he already felt how soon he would die. Because of this, he was incredibly happy. And happy putting a black piece on the board. The old man with the beard asked William not to wait for you because he would win anyway. But our main character didn't want to lose, so he was going to show how real champions play. With a satisfied grin on his face, he was about to put a black piece, directing his hand to the place where the black figure was supposed to be standing with the words to have his grandfather look at the defense of the 2-pronged thunderbolt. The guy suddenly grabs his head and feels incredible pain in his head and all over his body. The protagonist was immediately thrown into a sweat. The incredible pain was getting worse and worse with each passing second. To all the shivering guy from the spinning kolobak, a worried Zoya ran up and asked what was going on with William. With a trembling hand, he held his head, lowering his gaze down. He said that the poison seemed to have begun to take effect. The mother of 5 poisons, Look for the Bottom, smiled, and said that the poison had been dissolving through the protagonist's body all this time. And because of the game, the poison had finally worked. The worried girl immediately shouted out what the four of them were up to with an intimidating look, to which the bearded old man sitting near the table with the game replied that it was nothing like that except for his magic weapon. The old man explained that the black and white figures attacked the guy without his knowledge. The old man was interrupted by the mother of 5 YDs and the monk. The grandmother said that every time the old man said that, from his strategy, she wanted to pretend they did not know each other. The monk supported the mother of 5 YDs and completely agreed with her. The bearded old man told them to shut up. After which she continued to explain that during the game, the player's soul was gradually destroyed. The goal was to help cultivators, but since the protagonist was an ordinary mortal, and without a cultivator's soul, his energy was simply drained mind-damaged. After the words of the old man that he was in terrible pain and it was all the fault of the gun he was pointing at the girl, Zoya came to an incredible shock, frozen in place next to the protagonist who was in pain. Bowing his head, holding it with 2 hands, the guy heard that even without the poison, he would die in terrible agony. The girl tried to help the guy get up and said that she could, and finish all by herself. The protagonist was incredibly stubborn, and said that she did not stop him, and gave him the happiness to die in battle. The guy stood up with a smile on his face as nostalgia came over him, because he felt like he was back in the past. After all, William had already known in his past life what it was like to die of exhaustion, so he was serious about it. The old man with a beard was very angry with the main character standing in front of him, saw in front of him an incredible scary demon that was ready to tear him apart in the same minute. 15 minutes later, the calf protagonist was incredibly exhausted, but wasn't going to give up and kept playing. Across from him sat an old man. He was also incredibly emaciated, but he tried not to show it. With each taken black figure of the protagonist more and more tired of the game, under the eyes appeared bruises from the mouth was bleeding from poison. But he was determined to win, so he was not going to give up. The mother of the 5 poisons noticed the guy's condition, so she figured he didn't have long to live. Zoe doesn't have a moment to worry about the main character, and after saying the words to the grandmother, she was horrified and told William not to continue to play the game and that he should delay it as much as possible, because he could rest. All the guy did in response was shout back that she shouldn't worry, and he'd handle everything himself. Another 15 minutes later, it was already more noticeable that the old man was incredibly tired. Leaning on his knee with his hand, he could barely keep conscious, and only one thought was flying in his head, or the protagonist was really mortal. If the old man was still holding on, the guy was already completely knocked out and could barely move the pieces. But he kept saying that he was showing him what the real power of mortals and desire was. The protagonist was shaking all over, was able to make his move, the next move the old man had to make. A bolt of lightning ran through his entire body. From what pouring out was able to make a move. The old man tried to pick up the piece and put it down, but suddenly he lost consciousness. The old man fell unconscious, and before he lost it, he said he couldn't play anymore and fell to the floor, which meant a win for the guy. Slowly, the protagonist got to his feet, breathing very hard. An unconscious old man was lying in front of him. Even though William was very exhausted, he was very happy to have won. Suddenly, a shudder runs through him, and an incredible pain begins to set in, after which the protagonist spits out an incredible amount of blood. Zoya notices this, and anxiously heads towards the guy. The girl took him under her arm and asked him how he was feeling, to which William, with a heaviness in his legs, could barely stand and was having trouble breathing. The grandmother was horrified as she realized that the protagonist was able to neutralize the poison he drank earlier on her trial. While the guy was barely conscious, and there was an incredible amount of fog over him, and from his mouth came an incredible amount of saliva. He did not want to believe what the mother of the 5 poisons said. He hoped that he had heard what the grandmother had just said. The girl in the distance happily repeated that the protagonist was able to neutralize the poison, from which she was incredibly happy. After pointing her finger at the protagonist, the mother of 5 poisons was incredibly furious and said that the guy saw it coming and he was just waiting to neutralize the poison, but William said nothing in response. After all, he was incredibly depressed as he managed to neutralize the poison. His thoughts were only about it. Such words hurt him right in the heart because he wanted to die. At that time, the old man who was playing against the protagonist rose to his feet and told the mother of the 5 poisons to stop complaining. But she just started telling what happened because she was afraid that the guy wouldn't know the secret of Grandpa's game. With the beard, she made a poison that after he drank it, turned into a pyrotechnic meteor. The grandfather and the boy didn't know what the 5 poisons were talking about. She went on to explain that the poison was the property of her cult, and it was incredibly peerless, because after ingesting such poison into the bloodstream, the person's energy overflows, and at the end, the person is torn apart from so much energy. The guy managed to survive due to the fact that during the game, the board absorbed the excess energy in the body of the protagonist. Thus, William neutralized the poison without knowing himself. So the old men lost out because of the pyrotechnic meteor. Even the mother of 5 poisons herself, the creator of such a poison, couldn't think of such a thing. The protagonist did not give the appearance and wondered if they were crazy, because he had no idea that the last glass contained poison. Naga breaks into their conversation and says that the mother of 5 poisons is overestimating everything because how could he know about it in advance? Does she think that she could have thought of everything in such a short time? And Naga thought that it was just a coincidence. The protagonist turned at the troll's words, and then he was struck as if by lightning. The guy turned on his acting skills and started to agree that the leg was absolutely right. I was just a coincidence, the protagonist said it all through tears that was more convincing. The mother of 5 poison couldn't believe it was a coincidence, because when they signed more contract, the main character, incredibly knocked out, the leg looking doughy right in the eyes, said he was incredibly dumb. The mother of 5 poisons had nothing else to do but to agree with Naga. But there was one thing. Why the protagonist was completely calm after drinking the poison. Naga's eyes went wide and he didn't know what to say. As soon as the mother of 5 poisons continued to give facts in the form of that the guy was checking with her. Or really, he drank the poison, it was already very strange for her. Only realized that he was teasing her about it all the time. Somewhere standing off to the side, William started coughing up blood again. Naturally, Zoya noticed this and told him so. The grandmother kept brooding that since the guy had figured her out and also figured out the old man with the beard, and Zoya called him William. Standing behind the mother of the 5 poisons, Nagai and Lin were surprised that the grandmother was reasoning. Then, the mother of the 5 poisons concluded that William was the son of the eternal demonic master, whose name was Jim. Standing aside, the protagonist did not understand who she was talking about and asked her not to throw left to right unknown names. Zoya, as soon as she heard about what the mother of 5 poisons said, immediately tensed up. And a foot aside with Lin noticed it and was incredibly surprised. So guys, if you liked this video and want to see more videos, let's get 1,000 likes under this video. Also subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment. Until the next video.